I'm here to talk a little bit about Space Hulk, but in a more broad sense, I decided to go into different aspects of working with an external IP. Also a little bit about what is Space Hulk, also to set the expectations of going into some of the design challenges you have, taking a physical, well-known board game IP and put it into a video game. And lastly, just on my own choice, plugging Unity a little bit on how it helped us and how we work with it, and also a little bit about the cons that we run into. First off, a little bit about who we are. And I'll keep it short because that's always one of the boring parts. We're a small indie studio out of Copenhagen. We've been around since 2004 and specialized in turn-based strategy games the last 4 or 5 years. Always trying to do things self-funded and keeping ourselves independent and growing slowly and taking an iteratively approach to making games. Small games, build on top of that, build on top of that, build on top of that, and then grow the team. We're right now 12 people in the team, full-time employees, and yeah. We managed to do 7 self-financed games until now, and we have Space Hulk in production, and we're running a Kickstarter for Jagged Alliance right now. So in a few moments I'll stop and not move forward until you pledged. The type of games that we've done is starting down on small iOS games and then moving slowly upwards. We did Tactical Soldier, which is like a Resident Evil kind of turn-based game on iOS some years ago. Frontline Tactics was then the next, which was a Call of Duty style free-to-play mechanism turn-based strategy game, which we then managed to get on Steam, and now we're coming with Space Hulk moving forward. Almost undoctored in-game shots from Unity. Just a slight power fist that was painted on top of it because we didn't have the visual effects at that point in time. So that's what we're doing right now. I'll go into more details around that. And as said, we're right now at full production with Space Hulk, and as we move into the final stages of that game, I'm going to take the production team and slowly moving them over onto the Jagged Alliance project. Hopefully getting funded. We have until Thursday midnight, so go in. We still need some money. But that's going to be like a really, really cool game to take on as the next one. And then who knows what happens then. We're definitely happy working with licensed IP until now, but it has its challenges. And that is part of my talk today, is a little bit about working with this external IP. Until now, we have been working on the 7 games and a bunch of work for hire, primarily working on our own ideas and our own designs, and suddenly working with somebody else's ideas is actually a little bit of a challenge, but it's also really, really cool. But first of all, how does a small studio out of Copenhagen with 3-4 guys at that point in time actually get something like Space Hulk? For those who know what it is, it's a huge, huge thing. And at the end of the day, it comes down to the GDC and Game Connection being a really, really great place to be as game developers. For Space Hulk, it was absurd luck that we actually got it. I've been trying to approach THQ, who had the entire 40K license from Games Workshop as part of their license deal there. But they just ignored me for many years. Just a small, tiny studio, why should they even bother? And Space Hulk is a slight niche there. And even though they're working on Space Marine and some of the other big games, most likely it was just too small for them. I don't know. But it was at some morning in San Francisco in a hotel lobby. I was there waiting for a meeting, and suddenly this British guy stands right next to me, and we're warming our hands on this open fire pit place and starting chatting 10 minutes early, and suddenly we come into this discussion. Oh, what do you do? And I'd say, yeah, I do digital board games, basically, and something like Space Hulk, and that's absurdly fantastic. That's my dream project. And at the end of that, he just hands me his business card, and it's Ian Livingston, who is one of the 3 original founders of Games Workshop. So absurd luck on that one, and he introduced me, and from that on it was basically taking a trip to the UK, writing up some business cases, presenting him. There was a handful of other companies also wanting to do this, and timing-wise it was perfect because GHQ was handing back the license to Games Workshop at that point in time, and Games Workshop were looking for smaller studios making more of their chunks of their IP instead of selling the big one. So we were one of the first ones to actually get something of a 40K license in 15 years or something like that. Jagged Alliance is slightly similar, but a little bit different as well. It was a game connection. For those who don't know what that is, it's like a speed dating event with publishers and license holders and similar. It's being held twice a year, one in France and one in San Francisco. And if you have anything worth, or if you have anything to pitch, I urge you to go there. The amount of valuable business that comes out of that is absurd, even though it costs several thousand euros to go there. It's worth everything. I met up with BitComposer there, pitching Frontline Tactics to them at that point in time. They said, wow, that's the first step of the Jagged Alliance right there. And even though that we then signed Space Hulk, because that was my dream project, we've been keeping in touch moving forward based on that meeting a little over a year ago, and decided to sign a license with them and go out for a Kickstarter to simply stay independent still, and seeing if we could fund this on our own. So going to GDC and Game Connection was a key for us to getting these kinds of licenses, and I can see that several others have done that out as well, getting access to these kinds of things. Or if you want to sell your game and find a publisher for it, it's also a perfect place. Enough about that. So how is it actually working with somebody else's IP? There's a lot of positive things going on for that. I mean, every time, I don't even have to have a concept artist. The Warhammer 40K universe is so richly described and illustrated. You just Google, find some images. That's what we want. And that is a absurd situation being in. It's totally fantastic. Every little detail is described. The PR side is most likely the one that has had the biggest impact on us positively in terms of I pitch an interview and they come flocking. Hour after that I announced that we had the Space Hulk license, I had the Touch Arcade editor-in-chief and the Rock Paper Shotgun guy contacting me to make sure that we give them content to run. And that just doesn't happen normally. So having something that people love and like gives you access to the press really easily. And that's not the case when running on your own IP. I've tried that several times. That's really hard. And most likely the biggest thing is that you have an existing buyer base. You have some fans that you can speak to their heart, and you know that you're going to have some kind of core audience buying the game almost no matter what. You have a larger chunk of people who like 40K, they most likely will buy it, and then you have a huge turn-based strategy group as well that might not like 40K but might like this game. So you know that you're going to sell something versus maybe sell 10 copies of your own game if you messed up the launch, PR, and marketing, or if you didn't do anything at all. But there are also some pro and con sides of all this, because it's not necessarily easy working with licensed IP. Some part of your freedom is taken away. You can't just go out and in 40K put in a Hello Kitty kind of thing in one corner. You can't come up with crazy ideas and bend the rules and do some things that you would like to do, possibly. So that part is taking a little bit away from you. You have some of these constraints to work within, especially now for Space Hulk. Space Hulk is defined as these Terminators versus Gene Stealers. And Gene Stealers don't have ranged weaponry, and the Terminators have ranged weaponry, but they suck at close combat. So that's the entire schism here in a labyrinth kind of setting. If we were suddenly wanting to do orcs or chaos or other things because we would think that's cool, that's not inside the constraints of what Space Hulk is, and thus we can't do that. So there are some limits that you have to work up against. There might as well have been existing art that you have to look at and say, I can't change the look of something that somebody else has already done and it's been adapted into the 40K lore as such. This is how it looks like. And last but not least, there is some control that you have to give away. Every single piece of art that we produce has to run through an approval process. Everything. And partly is because Games Workshop is so protective about their IP. They want to make sure that what's shown to the public is high quality, it fits in the lore, it doesn't conflict with anything that might come in the pipeline further down the road, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, it's a positive thing as well, because we have somebody who's qualified sit there and bounce off. It's not QA, but it's still some kind of process that if you just get it through the approval process, you know that it's fitting into the universe. You don't have to go back and redo something fundamentally. And working with, especially Games Workshop, has been fantastic in that regards. We have gotten everything except one thing through approval in the first shot, even the things that we had to come up with. Because at the same time, we were given the freedom to sit down and define interiors of spaceships in a 40K universe, which nobody really has done before. How do gene stealers move when you look at them up close? How do they actually behave? All these things have not been explored before, so we were given the freedom to come in and define that, and that's going to be the baseline for whoever works with Space Hulk or Gene Stealers or Terminators moving forward. So as a fan, that's absolutely fantastic. But there is also some of these negative sides, and some of them are pretty obvious. It takes a shitload of time, money, patience to work with lawyers and contracts. I mean, these suckers are really, really big, and you sit there and negotiate for a long time to get these settled. Even if you're basically in agreement with each other, you still have lots of details to figure out. One of those things is, for example, ownership. I mean, everything that you produce is basically tied into somebody else's IP, and you don't own that. I mean, if I take a picture of a Coca-Cola bottle, I own the picture, but I don't own Coca-Cola or the bottle. I licensed it, so it's basically their property. I can't use it for anything else later on. So you give away some of the ownership, and where's the borderline of something I create that's generic and something that's tied into the IP? So those are some of those things in the contracts that you have to consider. And stakeholders. Every time you do something, every time I stand here or do an interview and such, I have to remind myself, hey, there's always somebody in the back, and I can't say everything because there are some things that's simply not public. Anyway, this guy, Jason Vandenberg from Ubisoft, he made a talk for GDC 2011, I think, in GDC Europe. And I really urge you to go in and take a look at this. It's a 1-hour talk that he has about working also creatively with somebody else's IP. And he's done a lot of stuff, and it's a really great talk. To spare you sitting there and looking at it, try to summarize it a little bit. And that is essentially what I also think that comes true no matter what it is you work with. Because as I said, 99% of us work for somebody else's idea. It might be internally as an artist. You have to work with the game designer or the lead artist or art director's idea of how it should look like. So you're actually working with somebody else's IP all the time, except if you're the art director and so on. But one of these most essential things is you can't make a game for existing fans without being one yourself. And if you're not a fan of it, you can still work on it, but you have to become a fan. And I think he really touches upon something that's essential there on, even if you're working on a Barbie game, as a 50-year-old hardcore guy with dreadlocks and what I don't know, if you don't understand what triggers an 8-year-old girl to sit there and play a Barbie game, how can you make something that she enjoys? So you have to force yourself into being a fan or becoming a fan to be able to create something in there. You have to learn everything about the IP. And it's not only a matter of I've played thousands of hours of Jagged Alliance. There you have to understand the why is that made this way. Just the how can be deducted by playing the games, watching the James Bond movies or whatever it is. But why is it that the color of Blood Angel is the way that it is? Why do they run around with their jewelry and so on? If you don't understand that, it's also hard adding something new in there. So essentially it comes down to embracing the constraints that you're working with, and you can still be hugely creative within those bounds. And that is really cool. Watch the talk. I'm really happy I found that one. So the big question is, would we work with external IP again versus going back to our own stuff? And I think we really want to do more of this. We want to keep exploring into this alley. Because the experience that we had now with Space Hulk in production and Jagged Alliance is that once you get on the side of being a fan, creating that kind of fantastic games that people already enjoy, just seeing a concept shot or talking about it is really gives you a big boost. But there's always that little one, unless the sales tank. I mean, if Space Hulk doesn't sell, we're not going to do another one. That's pretty obvious. Anyway, enough about that. Let's see some pictures. Space Hulk, what is that? For those who don't know that, it's basically a board game that was created over several times. It's this labyrinth that you build up with Terminators, these mighty, really tanks. They're 2.5-ton tanks walking around, and you have these ultra-fast gene stealers with claws that can rip you apart. The board game goes back to '89 and has a huge following. There was a limited edition made in 2009 that was like 100,000 units, and they were sold before going out into the stores. And I think they sold it for $80 or something like that. And it's right now sitting at $300, $350 on eBay if you want a pristine copy. So it's almost impossible to get into. So that's what we're doing, is digitizing this board game that was made in 2009. And I'll come back to that. But Space Hulk is also other things. EA made some video games throughout the 90s for different platforms. So some people might also know Space Hulk from that side, and not necessarily the board game. Space Hulk is also a card game. Fantasy Flight made a card game of that, and there's also even a novel around this. So people can come from different directions with different expectations, and that's one of those conflicts that I'll go into a little bit later on how do you actually work with that. Because if you say Space Hulk to somebody, it might be that they are looking at, hey, he's doing the video game, the remake of the EA one. No, I'm not. I'm not doing the card game either. I'm doing the board game. Space Hulk is part of the Warhammer 40K universe, and it's basically grown-up men and kids, sons, sitting painting small miniatures and playing war. But it's a huge, huge business. I think, was it last year they had 130 million pounds, British pounds in turnover, something like that, officially. So it's a crazy, crazy, crazy business. THQ has had the license for 14, 15 years or something like that. And some of the last games that they made were Space Marine and Dawn of War 2. Dawn of War series sold 6 to 7 million PC units, if I recall. And THQ also announced that Space Marine, the console version, I think was sold 1.2 million in the first quarter units. So it's huge, huge business also on the side. So getting access to this and being able to actually make a game into this universe is absolutely fantastic for a small independent like me. So, but what it is that we're doing, that is from our game. And we wanted to keep the board game feeling, but we wanted to do a little bit what XCOM did and take away a lot of this complexity, make it more action game, make it more visual, make it a modern computer game instead of just adhering to the board game itself. A small quick video if it plays. GameSpot took a video of development version that we showed at GDC this year and did a small video, and I just cut it down a little bit. You see some of the mechanics here with turn-based the animations on the Terminators is the one thing that we didn't get approved. But it's very up close, very visual, very nice looking as such, instead of looking at some of these classics turn-based games that were 2D, isometric, and looking kind of slightly boring. And we're going down and doing some of these action shots, trying to capture an up-close visual look of it. So that's what we're working on right now. Working with Spacehog as such has had a series of challenges, and that's maybe where some of the meat is here. One of the really first decisions we had to go into was what kind of game is it actually we want to do? Should we go with something that is very board game-ish? Do we do just flat surfaces and static miniatures that move around? All the way over into the other end where we want to get that nitty-gritty, bloody feeling that we also ended up with, deciding to go with. But we had a choice, and we had the choice that we had to do had huge consequences. Because going into the direction of the more video game-ish kind of thing had the same challenges, I think, as XCOM had, is making things more visually pleasing and more mass market. Also to broaden your audience. I mean, there might be 100, 150, 200,000 people who would buy the board game, who would buy the board game if we did it digitally. But expanding out, if we could grab some of that market from Dawn of War and Space Marine and some of the other 40K games, or even XCOM players, we would have a more mass audience appeal and still sticking to what Spacehog actually is. So that's one of the consequences. There was a lot of UI and game design choices that suddenly were made for you going that one. One of the more tricky ones is that Spacehog essentially puts you in a situation where you are the underdog. Even though you are this mighty Terminator, who usually in the 40K universe kills everything. Right here you get shredded to pieces playing the game. And players are not used to that kind of challenging gameplay anymore. I mean, usually when you have these kinds of productions, it's more a interactive movie that you're playing. That's at least how you feel it. And this game is actually more into the puzzler kind of direction, where you have to do the right moves in the right order and make sure that you actually kill those bastards, trying to crack the nut of how do I actually flame that control room if I only have 6 shots and I have to move the flamer up and he's limited ammo. So that again narrows down the potential audience for this kind of game. And we decided not to dumb that down. We wanted to keep that kind of challenging gameplay. Even though it might narrow down the potential audience, we would stay true to the fans. And that was back to the original one, become a fan. And one of the really challenging, and why do people actually play the board game, is that challenging element of, I played this level 4 times, and finally I beat it. If you get that kind of feeling playing a computer game, that's the essence of what we think is Spacehog is. So we're in that direction of calling it a turn-based strategy puzzler, and catching that kind of feeling, like Sokoban. Also, art pipeline-wise, the choice of going with more video game also meant that we had to do everything really high-res. Really high res. For us as a small studio, that was a challenge of getting that. We didn't want to do the flat surfaces, even though we could have gotten away with that. We had to do a full 3D environment with walls, and how does a ceiling look inside a Spacehog? Nobody has ever done that really. So we had to go back and figure out together with Games Workshop how does it actually look, and what's the feeling when you're in there? You still need it cramped. really dark and so on and so forth. So the budget suddenly exploded by having the choice of video game instead of just doing a one-to-one board game port. Another of these challenges that we ran into is that THQ and Relic actually set a bar that is pretty high for a small studio of 12 people like us. If we come out with something that looks slightly under par of what they could produce, then we would be looked at, what's that? So we suddenly had to sit down and actually do a pipeline for more or less a AAA production with a team of 12. And the only reason that it actually was something we could do is that Space Hulk as such is a small set of art pieces. If we did it intelligently with environment where we can turn on and off all these pipes and pieces and so on to create variation, then we could do it. But it's still a huge job to get this up. But we think that we actually did something that is better than what they had on Space Marine, if you look at the game up close. And even though it's a turn-based game where you actually will see it from the top most of the time, we have these action shots, and those are the selling kill shots that we put in. And it looks really cool. But also going down the video game, it has further consequences moving outside of just the basic core game of rule changes. And that's what really is one of those tough ones. Because there are some things that make sense in a board game, in a physical board game, when you're sitting next to your friend and sitting and playing a game, that don't make sense in a computer game when you do a single player kind of, even multiplayer. You have to wrap everything into a meta game. You have experience and progression and all these other things that the board game doesn't provide. You have storytelling on some point. How do you set the frame of playing these where it makes sense in a board game just to sit down, build a level, play it, and you have this meta game going on, storytelling going on between you and the other guy playing. Here you need a computer to tell you a story and frame it for you. I'll run pretty fast through some of these. I'm not going to go into too many details. But there are some board game rules that simply do not make sense in a computer game, that were made for bookkeeping purposes. When you're sitting there and playing the Gene Stealer side and you maybe have 20 Gene Stealers on a board, there are some rules that if you start picking a unit up and you move it with the action points it has, you can't go back to it again, because how do you keep track of what you moved and what you didn't? But the computer can do this for you. So reworking that was a simple one. Slightly more tricky. In the board game you have a flamer, heavy flamer, and when you flame it, the rule says that this tile section that might be a room or a too wide corridor, too long corridor, is set on flame. But that doesn't really make sense in a computer game, that you have to move the cursor up and down, and suddenly here is a 2 long corridor, and here's a 5 long corridor, and the flamer flames 2 there and 5 there. Why does it do that? So we had to change that over into a template-based system that's more in the computer game spirit. But boy, did that raise some problems with the community. There's some of these other things of what's easy in a board game. You can set up special rules because, okay, I deploy 1 unit, you deploy 1 unit. I deploy 1 unit, you deploy 1 unit. That's pretty easy in doing physically and agreeing to that. In the next mission, you deploy everything in certain areas. But suddenly you end up with an inconsistent deployment rule setting for a computer game, where here suddenly something happens because the board game rules dictated that. And there's most likely the last one here is that in a board game, some of these more simplistic mechanisms are totally fine, but in a computer game, they might feel lacking. So there has to be other things that keep you playing. There has to be something in there that works. And that's been a slight challenge to getting that in, but I think we got it. Essentially, it also comes down to this one. A rabid fan. For example, changing the flamer rules. We've been pretty open with what we're changing and working with. But the fan community, there are some really, really, really loud, hardcore players in that group that would buy the game anyway. that said, "You're destroying the game. You changed all my strategies of not being able to move that one tile there because you change it into a template instead of yada, yada, yada." And those people you have to deal with in a positive way. So there's a huge community management. And any kind of change you come in with that changes the perception of what they think is fun, their fan feeling creates hostility that you have to address. And I think that's one of those really, the biggest challenges that we have. It's no matter what we change, and trying to make it more casual is the wrong word, but more accessible, more usable for others. It puts some of these really hardcore players a little bit down, and they feel that you're destroying something for them. But I think it's good. I mean, it is a video game, and I'll stand up any day and defend some of these decisions, because you have to look at the media. I mean, one thing is a board game on a physical table, and another thing is enjoying a video game in there. It's just two different medias, and you have to do some changes and adopt it. Unless you only want to cater to the really, really hardcore board game players and make a one-to-one conversion, they will be happy. But the mass audience, and end of the day, game development is a business as well. You have to see how can you actually bring this out to a larger audience and make money without destroying the core essence. And that goes back to this: become a fan, know what's important, and catch that essence and put it into the video game. So, how does Unity work into this? And I wasn't asked to do this, so I did this on my own. Basically, we've been running Unity for a long time, and progressively having a strategy of just making a small game, building on top of that, building on top of that, building up our own turn-based framework that we're calling TH Engine. Taking some of these elements where we had from Monster Ball, the first network cable, I think in 2008 we had cross-platform networking running there, so iPad versus PC and Mac. Building on top of that, and we didn't use it in Tactical Soldier, but we used it in Frontline, and we're going to use it in Space Hulk as well. So there was a piece of code that we could reuse. It just enabled us as a small studio to build larger and larger games. I don't think that's necessarily a matter of Unity providing it, but it was so easy in Unity to have this. The technology and tool reuse. We have some internal editor sets that we've been building on top of Unity as such, and we've been reusing them and refining them all over and again and again. And I have a small example further down the road. Also the platformness. I mean, as a small studio, we couldn't do a PC game. Having the ability to build up both the tools and the framework and some of the art sets that we could build up, we could simply move straight from iOS to PC, and now we're sitting and talking some console deals based on more or less the same art set and same code. Super, super fantastic for us to be able to pursue the deals that suddenly show up. Why don't you do an Android? Yeah, let's do an Android if you pay for it. Their Android market is a little so-and-so. But suddenly getting access to some publisher that thinks, hey, I want to do a retail Space Hulk box thing. Yeah, let's sit down, because I'm using Unity, and given the right amount of money, I can get a console license, and then we're talking about it. Half my team had really, for Space Hulk, had no big experience with Unity, working with it. They were just artists doing it. But bringing them into the tool set and having some of these features of like LOD system, we added LOD, and it saved us at least 20 to 40% frames per second compared to running it without it. That was a 3-day job of replacing all the art, having small, lower poly versions, and just somebody who's never done it before sit down and actually work with it, and gave a huge performance boost. Some of these later changes of the rendering pipeline, we have a huge amount of lights in Space Hulk, and at GDC when we were showing it, we had guys from Blizzard and stuff like that coming up and asking us, is that Unreal 4? I was like, what? But I think that's a quality question. I don't know. But the deferred rendering and also the light mapping and light probe systems in Unity really helps us create this look that isn't Unity. When you look at the game and it's running, it doesn't look like your classic Unity game. And I think that's a great job from the team, and it's so easy to use. This multi-platform thing is the reason why we as a studio use Unity, basically, as a primary thing. We can do this game in a one-year production cycle, and even talking to the consoles is a little bit more tricky, but that's it. And just a really quick first view of some of the tool sets that we've been building up to be able to run this. This is application built in Unity using NGUI, so it's not using any editor setups, but we're gonna give that out to end users so they can actually play or build their own levels and configure them and publish them and share them inside the game across platform. So we're also using it for tool sets, as I said. But there are some things that I don't like around Unity as well. The UI really sucks is maybe a strong word, but we're using something else. We've been using that for ages, building up our own GUI system. I hope that Unity at some point in time actually gets a new system up and running in there. Networking as well. Never liked the system in Unity, especially the scalability of it. And fortunately, there are some alternatives. SmartFox Server as being one. I coded the API for Unity. Photon as well, really good choices and alternatives. And especially this console port part is really expensive for us indies. If you don't find a publisher or have one of the platform holders pay for the licenses, it's good luck on that. So, but hopefully some of those things change a little bit. Can always hope so. And I guess that's basically end of my talk. So thanks for listening. I think there's a Q&A session, I don't know. But otherwise, I'll be in the round table bar right after here, where we can ask me anything about it. Tons of details I can't go into around Spacehawk, but there's also stuff I can show and let you play the game if you're interested, or ask me any questions.